The air was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that makes even the smallest breath feel loud. Across the valley, where the fields once shimmered with golden grain and the trees bent low with ripe fruit, there was nothing but emptiness. The land that had fed generations, the soil that held the memory of ancestors, was stripped bare, taken by hands that had no right to it. To those who had taken it, the land was just property, just dirt, just numbers on a ledger. But to her, it was everything. It was the sound of laughter in the mornings, the taste of fresh bread in the evenings, the warmth of stories told under the stars. It was life itself. And they stole it. But theft alone wasn't enough for them. They wanted more. They wanted to break her spirit, to turn her strength into weakness, to remind her that power was not hers to keep. They left her with scars that would never fade, hands that once nurtured life now trembling with pain. Hands that once sowed, harvested, cooked, and comforted were left shattered, as if to erase her role in the world. What they didn't understand was that pain has a way of traveling. It doesn't stay trapped inside one person. Pain spills, it reaches others, and sometimes it becomes the spark that lights a fire far greater than anyone expects. He saw it. He saw the way her eyes no longer lit up when she looked across the horizon, the way her shoulders sank as if the weight of mountains pressed down on them. He saw how silence replaced her laughter and how fear crept into her every gesture. And something in him broke too, not in weakness, but in fury. Fury at the injustice, fury at the cruelty, fury at the audacity of those who thought they could take what they pleased and destroy who they wished without consequence. He wasn't the kind of man who shouted his rage. He wasn't the kind who made speeches or demanded the world notice. His anger was quiet, but it was sharp. It sat in his chest like a blade, waiting for the moment to be drawn. He wasn't interested in balance or fairness. He wasn't looking for apologies or second chances. No, he carried her pain as if it were carved into his own flesh, and he vowed that those who shattered her hands would one day feel the same breaking inside themselves. But vengeance isn't simple. It isn't clean. It isn't just a path of anger. It's a road filled with choices, with risks, with the danger of losing oneself in the very darkness one fights against. Every step he took toward them, every plan he shaped in silence, was a step deeper into a storm he might never escape. He knew it. He felt it. Yet he moved forward because to him, her brokenness was unbearable, and his silence was no longer an option. The story you're about to hear is not just about land stolen or hands shattered. It's about the strength that rises from pain, the promise made in silence, and the lengths one will go to when love, loyalty, and rage intertwine. It's about a vow whispered not to the world, but to the heart of a broken soul. I will make them pay. I will shatter them as they shattered you. But vows come with consequences, and as his journey begins, shadows gather, secrets emerge, and the question remains, how much will he lose in the name of vengeance? Will justice heal her? Wounds or will revenge consume them both? The path has only just opened, and already it is lined with danger. What waits at the end is something neither of them could imagine. The valley had always been a place of promise. Long before the betrayal, long before the quiet suffering, it was a land that carried the rhythm of life in every corner. Each morning, the mist would rise gently from the earth, curling around the low hills, softening the edges of stone and tree until the world looked like it was breathing. Birds called out as though to greet the sun, and the soil, dark and rich, promised growth to anyone willing to work it with care. Families had lived there for generations, each one tied to the land not by documents or titles, but by sweat, laughter, and memory. That was the way it had always been, until outsiders came with eyes that saw only profit and ownership. They arrived first with polite words. the kind that hide sharp edges beneath their sweetness. Promises of partnership, of progress, of shared prosperity. At first, some believed them, or at least wanted to. After all, it was easier to hold on to hope than to confront the possibility of deceit. But hope quickly turned sour. Those who had once been welcomed as guests revealed their true nature. They drew lines on paper that cut across homes, orchards, and rivers as though ink was stronger than roots. They carried papers stamped with seals that declared the land was theirs now, dismissing generations of history with a single signature. She had stood among them on that day, her hands clenched, but steady, refusing to yield. She had spoken with a voice that trembled not from fear, but from the sheer weight of truth. This land is not yours to take. It is ours because we have lived here, bled here, and built here. You cannot own what you have never cared for. Her words carried across the field, but they fell on ears deafened by greed. To them, her voice was nothing but noise, her presence nothing but an obstacle to be removed. When they acted, they did not only strip the soil beneath her feet, they stripped her of the very tools of her being. Her hands, once strong and sure, were left broken. It was not an accident. It was not a careless act. It was deliberate, a cruel reminder of what power can do when it has no conscience. They thought by shattering her, they would silence her forever. What they failed to see was the flame that would ignite in another heart. He had watched from the edge of the crowd, his fists curling tighter with every word dismissed, every cruel laugh that echoed in the air. He was not her blood, but he had grown beside her, learned the same songs of the land, eaten from the same harvest. To him, her pain was personal. It was not just an attack on her, it was an attack on all of them, on everything they believed, in everything they had built with bare hands and unshakable faith. In the nights that followed, silence filled their home. The fields lay untouched, the tools rested against the walls, and the air seemed heavier, as though carrying sorrow on its back. She sat often by the doorway, staring out at the land that had once brought her joy. He saw the way her gaze lingered, the way her lips moved as though she whispered to the soil itself, apologizing for what she could no longer give. And in those moments, he made his vow, not spoken aloud, not written down, but sealed within himself. He would not let this stand. But vengeance is never born in a single heartbeat. It grows, slowly, fed by memory and by the constant sting of injustice. Each time he saw her struggle to lift a cup or to tie a cloth, his resolve deepened. Each time, he heard the stories of neighbors forced from their homes, their land swallowed by greed. His anger sharpened. He began to notice things he had once overlooked. The way those who had taken the land always traveled with a certain arrogance, the way they carried themselves as though untouchable. He studied their patterns, their habits, their weaknesses, storing away every detail, yet beneath his growing rage, there was also fear. Not fear for himself, but fear of what his path would do to her. If he went too far, if he became too consumed by the fire inside him, what would she see when she looked at him? Would she see the boy she had once known, or would she see another, shadow of the cruelty that had already broken her? That question haunted him, pressing against his determination like a stone in his shoe, always present, never letting him forget the risk. Still, the nights offered no peace. Dreams came, sharp, and vivid dreams of the land restored, dreams of her hands whole again, dreams where laughter replaced silence. But dreams gave way to reality, and reality was a constant ache. He knew he could not undo what had been done to her. He could not heal her scars, no matter how deep his love or loyalty. But what he could do was ensure that those who had caused them would one day feel the weight of their own actions. Whispers began to move through the valley. Some said he was planning something. Others warned him to let it go, to protect himself, to accept what had happened and move on. But how does one move on when injustice sits like a wound that refuses to close? How does one bury the memory of pain that still bleeds fresh each day? He listened, but he did not answer. Silence was safer. Plans were safer when unspoken. As days turned into weeks, a strange tension began to spread across the land. The ones who had taken it grew bolder, their grip tightening, their laughter louder. They thought fear had taken root, that no one would dare rise against them. And perhaps to some extent they were right. Fear was real, but so was resolve. And in the quiet spaces between dusk and dawn, when the valley seemed to hold its breath, he began to prepare. Every story has a moment when the balance tips, when silence becomes action, when patience becomes impossible. His moment was coming, and though he did not yet know how or when, he felt it pressing closer with each passing day. He carried her pain, he carried the memory of her broken hands, and he carried the vow he had made in silence. The land still waited. The soil still remembered. And in its quiet, it seemed to whisper to him too, not with words, but with a weight that urged him forward. What he did not yet realize was that the path he chose would not only test his strength, but reveal truths, buried deeper than the roots of the valley itself. Shadows waited, not just around those he hated, but within his own steps. And as the line between justice and vengeance blurred, the question remained. Would he bring healing, or would he bring ruin? The night would answer soon enough. The days stretched longer, and though the sun still rose and set as it always had, the valley no longer felt the same. There was a weight in the air, like something unseen pressing down on every breath, every step. People moved quietly, glancing over their shoulders more often than before. Conversations happened in whispers, cut short whenever strangers passed. The land that once gave life and unity now carried tension, fear, and silence. And beneath it all, the conflict grew, waiting to surface like a storm held back by fragile clouds. For him, the battle wasn't only against those who had stolen the land and broken her spirit. It was also against the creeping doubt that tried to take root in his mind. Each night he asked himself the same question. Would striking back truly bring justice, or would it turn him into the very thing he despised? The promise he had made to her wasn't just about vengeance. It was about giving her back the dignity and peace that had been ripped away. But dignity could not be bought with blood alone, and peace was harder to find in a world where greed had already poisoned the soil. She too carried her own war within. Outwardly she seemed quiet, often retreating into the shadows of her own thoughts, her broken hands resting uselessly in her lap. But in her silence lived a storm. She hated what had been done to her, hated the helplessness forced upon her, and most of all, she feared what he might become if he pursued the path of vengeance too far. She wanted justice, yes, but not if it meant losing him to the same darkness that had destroyed her. Yet she could not stop him. She saw it in his eyes every time he looked at her. His anger was no longer something he could let go of. The villagers whispered their own versions of the story. Some believed he was destined to rise against those who had taken everything, to stand as a voice for the silenced. They spoke of him as though he were chosen, as though the land itself had placed its hopes on his shoulders. Others, though, looked at him with unease. They warned that anger could twist even the strongest heart, that revenge, once taken, could poison not only a man, but everyone around him. To them, he was a danger waiting to unfold. Meanwhile, those who had seized the land grew more ruthless in their pursuit. They expanded further, their reach stretching beyond the valley, taking not only soil, but water, timber, and lives. They tightened their control with rules and threats, making sure every villager understood who held the power. They wanted obedience, silence, and submission. And for a while they thought they had achieved it. Yet beneath the surface, resentment smoldered. Quiet anger filled the hearts of the people, and though most were too afraid to act, all it would take was a spark to set them ablaze. He became that spark. He started small, not with open defiance, but with subtle acts of resistance. Tools that were meant to enforce control went missing. Supplies that had been stolen mysteriously found their way back to their rightful owners. At first, no one knew who was behind it, but whispers spread quickly. Some saw it as proof that the fight was not over, that someone still had the courage to stand. Others worried it would only bring harsher punishment when the truth was discovered. And both sides were right. The tension between the oppressors and the oppressed grew sharper with every passing day. Patrols doubled. Threats grew louder. Fear thickened in the air, and still he continued. His resolve was no longer only about her. It was about all of them, about the valley itself, about the countless lives connected to the soil. He could not turn back now, not when he had already stepped so far into the shadows. But his fight came at a cost. Sleep left him. Trust began to slip from his hands. Even those who once supported him now looked at him with wary eyes, wondering if his fire would save them or burn them alive. And she, watching him unravel, felt the distance grow between them. She wanted to reach him, to remind him of the boy, who once laughed freely in the fields, who dreamed not of vengeance but of life, of family, of peace. But every time she tried, he pulled further away, consumed by the promise he had made. What made it worse were the secrets that began to surface. Whispers told of betrayals not from outside, but from within the valley itself. There were those who had aided the oppressors, who had traded loyalty for safety, who had turned their backs on their neighbors in exchange for protection. These betrayals cut deeper than any wound from an enemy, and the realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. If even those bound to the land by blood and history could be corrupted, who could truly be trusted? The conflict was no longer simple. It wasn't only about land, or hands shattered, or promises made. It was about truth hidden beneath layers of lies, about neighbors who could be enemies, about enemies who seemed untouchable, and about a valley holding its breath, waiting for someone to make the next move. Every path he could take seemed to lead deeper into danger, and every choice he faced carried consequences that stretched far beyond himself. Yet he could not stop. To stop would mean surrender. To stop would mean letting them win, letting her. Broken hands become the final word in their story, and he could not bear that. So he pressed forward, one step at a time, even as the line between right and wrong blurred with every passing moment. Some nights, when the world was quiet, he would walk the edge of the fields, listening to the whispers of the earth. He swore. The land spoke to him, reminding him of its memory, of its endurance. It had survived storms, droughts, and floods, and it would survive this too. But its survival came at a price, and he was beginning to understand that the price might be him. The conflict was no longer just around him. It lived inside him. And as the valley watched in silence, waiting, the tension built to a breaking point. The question was not whether the storm would come, but when and who would be standing when it passed. And in the shadows of that uncertainty, a new truth stirred, one he had not yet seen, but one that would change everything when it revealed itself. The nights grew darker, not because the moon had disappeared, but because the weight of what was coming pressed down on everything. It was as if the valley itself knew a breaking point was near. The wind carried an edge that it hadn't carried before, sharp and restless, rattling the trees as though warning of a storm that no shelter could withstand. Every sound seemed louder, every silence heavier. People spoke even more carefully, their eyes darting not only at the oppressors, but at one another. Trust was thin, fragile, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. He moved through these nights like a shadow, silent, but never still. Each step he took was deliberate, each decision sharpened by the memory of her pain and the vow he had buried deep in his heart. He knew the risk. He knew the price could be everything. Yet he pressed forward, because the thought of doing nothing was unbearable. It wasn't just her broken hands anymore. It was every family forced from their land, every child who looked at the fields and saw emptiness where abundance once lived. Their suffering lived inside him now, and it burned like fire in his chest. The oppressors felt something too. They could sense the quiet defiance, the unseen hand that moved against them in the dark. Their grip tightened. Their men grew harsher. Orders were shouted with less patience, punishments delivered with more cruelty. It was no longer enough for them to take land. They wanted fear to settle so deep in the hearts of the people that no thought of resistance could ever rise again. But their very hunger for control became the fuel that fed his determination. Every cruelty, every humiliation they forced upon the valley pushed him closer to the edge where waiting was no longer possible. She felt it too, the shift in him. She had seen his eyes harden, his voice grow colder, his nights spent away from her side. She feared not only what he was planning, but what it was turning him into. At times, she wanted to beg him to stop, to let it go, to leave the valley behind and start anew somewhere else. But each time the words rose to her lips, she swallowed them back. She knew he would never leave. The land was not just soil beneath his feet. It was memory, blood, and identity. To walk away would be to let it die, and neither of them could do that. Rumors began to stir of something coming, an act greater than the small defiance he had carried out in silence. Some whispered that he was planning to strike at the heart of those who had stolen everything. Others believed it was just talk, nothing more than smoke without flame. But the tension in the air said otherwise. The valley waited, the people waited, even the oppressors waited, though they didn't know for what. Everyone could feel the line thinning, ready to snap. He felt it most in the stillness before dawn, when the sky was neither night nor morning. When the world seemed caught between endings and beginnings, that was when his thoughts were sharpest, when the memories of her broken hands burned brightest, when the vow he had made echoed loudest in his mind. He told himself again and again that he was not doing this for revenge alone. He was doing it so the valley would breathe again, so the land would no longer feel like a graveyard, so children could grow without fear. But deep inside, he could not deny that his fury burned hotter than his hope. The valley's silence was not total. There were others like him, though none as bold. Some came to him quietly, their voices low, their eyes carrying the same anger. They offered help, loyalty, strength. But with each ally came a greater risk of betrayal. He didn't know who he could trust, and yet he knew he couldn't face what was coming alone. The enemy was too powerful, their reach too strong. He needed the courage of others, even if trusting them meant opening himself to new wounds. And then, one night, the silence broke. A message reached him. News of something, planned by the oppressors, something that would crush what little spirit the valley still had. It wasn't just about land anymore. They were preparing to make an example so brutal that no one would ever dare resist again. If it happened, the valley would never recover. That was the moment he realized the climax was no longer his choice. It was coming, whether he was ready or not. The air grew tighter in the days that followed, as though every breath carried the weight of expectation. She sensed it, though he didn't speak of it. The way he moved, the way his hands shook slightly when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his eyes scanned the horizon, as if searching for something unseen, it told her everything. She wanted to stop him, to pull him back before the point of no return, but the look in his eyes silenced her. It was not just determination, it was inevitability. The villagers felt it too. They walked with unease, their conversations clipped, their gazes heavy with questions they dared not voice. Some looked to him with hope, others with dread, but no one could deny that something was about to change. The valley had lived in silence for too long, and silence, like soil, can only hold so much before it cracks open. And then came the night when the valley seemed to hold its breath completely. The stars hung above, cold and distant, the wind restless, carrying with it the sound of something waiting. He stood at the edge of the fields, the same fields where generations had once planted dreams, and knew there was no turning back. His vow was no longer words in his heart. It was action waiting to strike. But even as he stood there, he felt the weight of shadows not just around him, but within him. The line between justice and vengeance was so thin now, he could no longer see. Yet he was ready to act, ready to strike, ready to face whatever storm would follow. The valley waited with him, caught in the pause before thunder, in the silence before fire, and somewhere in the dark, unseen eyes watched, unseen hands prepared, unseen truths stirred. The moment was coming. The storm was about to break. The question was not if, but how, and what would be left standing once it did. The night that held its breath finally exhaled. He stood at the edge of the fields with the plan burning in his chest, ready to cross a line he knew he might never return from. The wind rushed through the dry stalks like a warning, like a voice that wanted him to listen before it was too late. He took one step, then another, until a small sound stopped him cold, a soft tapping behind him, careful and steady. She was there in the moonlight, shawl around her shoulders, eyes bright with worry and something else he hadn't seen in a long time. Quiet strength. "I know what you want to do," she said. Her words were calm, not pleading. "But don't let them choose the person you become." He looked down at her hands, still marked by pain, but no longer the whole of her. She held a cloth bundle and pressed it into his palms. Inside were a few seeds, brown and small, saved from the last harvest before everything was taken. "These are older than all of us," she whispered. "Plant them tomorrow. Not because the world is fair, but because we will make it fair." The sow. Blade inside his heart loosened. He listened to the night again, and the night did not push him forward. It pulled him back to the soil, back to breath, back to what mattered. He closed his fingers around the seeds. The vow he had carried for so long, break them as they broke her, moved and changed. It did not disappear. It became something steadier. Not a promise to destroy, but a promise to restore. At dawn he went to see an elder who kept records for the valley, a quiet keeper of borders and stories. The elder opened a wooden chest and brought out maps inked by hand, deeds older than the newcomers' papers, and small stones marked with symbols used by their ancestors to trace water and pathways. "They drew new lines," the elder said, "but the old lines are still there if you know how to see them." Together they marked boundary trees and hidden markers that only those raised on the land would recognize. They gathered witness statements, clear, simple words from those who had been pushed away. Each story was a piece of ground reclaimed. Each map was proof that land rights were more than ink and seals. They were memory and work, and the truth of lived life. In those days, the whispers of betrayal that had haunted the valley also came to a head. One of the villagers, one who had been seen speaking too often with the outsiders, came forward with a face pale as clay. He admitted he had passed on information in exchange for safety, that fear had led him where dignity could not. He brought ledgers, copies of messages, notes of meetings. The truth hit hard. Anger rose in the room like heat. But the elder placed a hand on the table and said, "Let the truth be a seed, not a match." They would not hide what he had done, but neither would they throw him away. He would help repair what fear had broken. Word spread quietly. They spoke less of revenge and more of accountability. They practiced telling the story so no detail was lost. When the outsiders arrived, what they said, what they took, how they mocked the people, how they tried to erase lines and history. They learned the language of petitions and filings, but they also prepared for something even stronger, a public day where the valley would speak with one voice. Not a fight in secret, but a truth no one could ignore. It would be peaceful protest with cameras and witnesses, a living record too large to be buried. Justice and transparency became the new keywords that passed from mouth to mouth with steady courage. The day came with a clean blue sky and a hard edge in the air. Families walked to the fields together. Some carried tools, not as threats, but as symbols of work and care. Others carried baskets with water and bread. The elder brought, the maps. She walked beside him, slower than before, but firm. He carried the seeds in his pocket and the documents under his arm. At the path's bend, they could see the outsiders' vehicles lined up like a wall. Men stood there with arms crossed, bored, at first, then tense when they saw the size of the crowd. He stepped forward and spoke, not with anger, but with clarity. He told the story once, then again, each time simpler, each time sharper. He held up the maps and the markers. He named elders who had worked the land, named rivers and stones and trees with a history deeper than any stamp. He said the words that mattered: land rights, community, accountability, restoration, then moved aside so others could speak. A mother told how her child still woke at night asking when they could go home. A farmer described the day the water was fenced off. A teacher spoke of the songs the children no longer sang because the fields were quiet. Phones recorded. Voices rose, not in shouts, but in a chorus of steady truth. The men at the vehicles shifted, uncertain now. A call had gone out early that morning, to a local journalist who had listened before when no one else would, to a lawyer who knew the old laws, to a district officer tired of signing papers that smelled of corruption. They arrived not as saviors, but as witnesses who could carry the story beyond the valley. When the leader of the outsiders stepped out, he wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He waved a stack of documents and talked about progress, about development, about how the valley should be grateful. But this time, his words rang hollow in the open air. The elder unfolded the oldest map. The lawyer pointed to water rights recognized long ago. The district officer's eyes narrowed at the ledgers the betrayer-turned-witness had brought. The journalist asked simple questions the man could not answer without twisting. Cameras caught every hesitation. The crowd did not move forward. They did not break lines. They stood like trees whose roots held them upright. When orders were barked to disperse, no one did. They sang instead, a low hum that rose and fell like wind over grain. The sound carried to the hills. It filled the spaces between people who had been strangers in fear and made them neighbors again. Nonviolent resistance, truth, and solidarity turned a fragile gathering into a force. By evening, the district officer read out a decision to freeze all activity. An inquiry had been opened. The paper the outsiders held could no longer move them. Past the weight of evidence and the strength of witnesses, their leader tried to laugh it off, then saw no one was laughing. The wall of vehicles looked smaller in the light that lingered at the edge of the day. The men stepped back. Not a victory parade, not a sudden miracle, but a turning. The inquiry moved faster than anyone expected, not because power was kind, but because power had been seen. The journalist's story traveled. The lawyer filed carefully. More maps appeared from chests and attics. People from neighboring valleys came with their own memories, their own stones marked with old signs, their own testimonies. Corruption that had felt like a locked door started to give way as more hands pressed against it. When the findings were read weeks later, they were simple. Illegal seizure, forged authorizations, water taken without rights, intimidation documented by dozens of voices. The papers that once looked invincible were stripped of their lies. The land was to be restored. Penalties were named. Names were written down that had never been spoken aloud before. No one cheered right away. They just stood quiet and let the news sink in, because joy after fear is a fragile thing. He looked at her and she looked at him, and they both understood what the moment meant. It did not heal everything. It did not erase scars, but it gave the valley its breath back. Work began the next morning. Fences were taken down, water flowed again. People returned to homes with broken doors and dust on the floors and made them whole. They planted together. He dug the first line and dropped in the seeds she had given him. She knelt beside him and covered them with careful strokes, her hands sure despite their pain. She would always carry what had been done to her, but the valley would carry her too. She started a seed circle where elders taught the young how to save and share. Someone else reopened the small school. Another formed. A cooperative, not with big promises, but with simple agreements, fair prices, shared tools, common work. The betrayer who had confessed took on the hardest jobs without pay for a while, repairing channels, clearing fields, listening more than he spoke. This was not easy forgiveness. It was responsibility. As the fields greened again, the valley changed shape, not just on the surface but underneath. Trust does not return as fast as rain, but it returns with steady care. They held nights of truth-telling where people said what fear had kept them from saying. They wrote their own rules for the land, plain words anyone could understand. They kept copies with the elder and copies with the children, so memory would not vanish when old hands grew tired. They planted trees along the river, not for quick harvest, but for the long breath of the valley's future. Words like community, justice, resilience, and healing turned into work, and the work turned into life. He no longer walked like a shadow. The edge in him softened, but his strength did not fade. He found that leadership wasn't a speech or a strike. It was showing up every morning and choosing courage over pride. When people asked what had changed him, he would touch the small cloth pouch in his pocket and say, "A promise redirected." He had vowed to answer pain with pain. He learned to answer pain with truth and persistence. That did not make him gentle all the time. It made him honest. She became the heart of the valley's new rhythm. Children came to her courtyard to learn how to knead dough and save seeds and read old lines on new maps. She taught them that land is a living story, that land rights are not arguments to win but relationships to keep. When her hands hurt, others took up the tasks without fuss. When she laughed, it sounded like the fields finally remembering their songs. In time, the outsider's leader stood in a different light, called to account beyond the valley. He was not a monster in chains, not a ghost in the hills, just a man who had believed his papers could silence people forever. The law, slow and flawed as it can be, did its work because the valley had done its own first. The story reached places the people had never seen, and other valleys learned to gather their maps and their memories too. On the first harvest after the land's return, the valley held a quiet feast. No speeches, no fireworks, only bread, fruit, and long tables. He placed a loaf in front of her. She broke it and handed him the first piece. After a while, he stood and looked at all the faces lit by evening light. "We were told our voices were small," he said. But a chorus carried, "Farther than a shout." He let the words rest. No one needed more. Later, when the moon rose, they walked the boundary path where he had once planned to cross a darker line. The earth felt different beneath his feet, steady and alive. He thought of the night she had stopped him, and how a handful of seeds had turned a vow from breaking into building. He thought of the elders' maps, the witness who chose truth after fear, the long days of slow justice that had remade them all. Before they went home, he knelt and pressed his hand to the soil, not to claim it, but to thank it. The land held, his touch the way it holds rain, quietly, completely. He stood, took her hand, and together they walked back through fields that breathed again. The valley was not perfect, it was whole, and that, at last, was enough.